So good morning. Welcome to the 8th ESG Talk organized by Candriam. The ESG Talks are an extension of the Candriam Academy, which is Candriam's online e-learning platform on ESG. My name is David Czupryna. I will be your host today. Just a few points about logistics. This call is being recorded. You can ask your questions at any time. Please use the Q&A box within Zoom to ask them, and I will field them to our panelists during the course of the conversation. So the topic today is the food and beverage, and specifically, we thought it would be interesting to see to what extent, what are the main challenges and opportunities faced by the food sector from a sustainability standpoint. What are the solutions, what are the innovations that are the horizon solutions to the main challenges that we will explain, and to discuss and bring you some knowledge about this topic. Today I have with me three panelists, which I will introduce now. First, Carlotte Lucas. Carlotte Lucas is the Corporate Engagement Manager at the Good Food Institute Europe. The Good Food Institute Europe, for those who don't know it, is an international NGO helping to build a more sustainable, healthy and just food system by transforming meat production. And as Corporate Engagement Manager, Carlotte works with stakeholders across the industry, including food manufacturers, startups, investors, retailers and food service establishments, to increase the quality, the quantity, and the availability of plant-based meats in the marketplace, and to prepare these companies to the arrival of cultivated meat as well. Carlotte holds degrees in economics and international studies from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. So good morning to you, Carlotte. Then we have David Nickell with us as well. David is Vice President of Sustainability and Business Solutions at DSM, Animal Nutrition and Health. And for those who don't know, DSM is a company that's been instrumental in developing solutions to help tackle some of the food industry's most acute sustainability challenges. And within the company and that sector, David has spent over 2 decades working in animal nutrition and health in global business innovation and sustainability roles. And in particular, has been instrumental in the development of innovations ranging from novel feed enzymes, alternative protein technologies, and eubiotics that address the issues of natural resource use and the shift away from antibiotics, one of the key challenges within that sector in animal production. As well as technologies that lead to substantial reductions in livestock emissions, another key challenge. And David holds a PhD in marine biology from the University of Stirling. Good morning to you, David. And last but not least, we have also with us Sairindri Christisabrina. Sairindri joined Candriam a few months ago as the lead analyst, ESG analyst, I might add, for the food and beverage sector. And she brings with her years of experience working in food supply chain, due diligence, responsible sourcing, and social compliance. She's worked previously for the Consumer Goods Forum, UNICEF, Human Rights Watch, and the United Nations, and she holds degrees in human rights and international relations. Good morning, Sairindri. Great to have you with us today. Before we get started proper in the conversation, we thought it would be useful for this particular topic that Sairindri first shed some lights about the challenges faced by companies within that sector, as well as the key ESG challenges that we as a society face to reduce the externalities caused by that sector. So I leave the floor to you, Sairindri, to spend a few minutes sharing your thoughts about that.
Sure. Thanks a lot, David, for the introduction, and welcome everyone. 3 points. I would like us to start with 3 points. So in these 3 points, I really like us to keep in mind throughout the discussion. First being, the food and beverage industry is among the most transversally demanding sector of resources. Second, companies within this industry are typically characterized with very complex web of supply chains and normally frequently entangled as well with ESG risk and controversies, which absolutely and consequently make the companies within these industries become a constant subject to current and emerging regulations. Third point is, because of these externalities and challenges the industry faces, and also the impacts we're globally facing, this makes the industry becomes well-positioned and at the core of addressing these impacts, such as climate change impacts, resource scarcity, and biodiversity loss. Let's dive into more detail for each element. So when I think about this industry, I see this industry as the one selling perishable goods, but the industry itself will never perish. That is to say that food and beverage industry will never cease to exist or innovate unless humans cease to exist first. And when we speak about this industry, it is very much closely linked to agricultural production. So when we speak about agricultural production, we include land-based agriculture, seafood-related production, and aquaculture, and as well as food processing manufacturing, as well as logistics-related distributions, all of which we know of depend highly on natural resources, raw commodities, and energies. The data shows that out of the 71% of our habitable land, 50% of which is already used for agriculture. And within that, 77% of that has been used, particularly for raising livestock for dairy and meat production. And this is just one resource that we focus on, which is land. If we look into the freshwater resources, agriculture is among the most water-intensive industry. 70% of our global freshwater withdrawals came from agriculture. And let's touch upon a little bit about the impact that the production itself has. On the pollution side, we know that the industry has been facing pollution issues. 78% of our global ocean and freshwater pollution comes from agriculture. And this is mainly due to the eutrophication process, which basically occurs when the environment becomes too enriched, which then maintain the growth of harmful algal blooms or low oxygen levels due to the high use of nitrate and phosphate fertilizers. Now that we speak about the natural resources, let's talk about another infamous reference or impact of the industry. Agriculture has been considered as the second largest of greenhouse gas emitting, the most greenhouse gas emitting sector after energy. And this includes as well transportation. And the data that you see in the screen here only encapsulates the data from the farm until the shelves. And we haven't really talked about the food waste. We haven't really considered the food waste greenhouse gas emissions that it produces. Next one, we speak about raw commodities reliance. And agriculture is highly associated with forest risk commodities. In fact, between 70% and 80% of our deforestation rate is associated to converting land into agricultural production or tree plantations. Beef production, as you can see from the graph, is the largest driver of tropical deforestation, as you could see here. And it is followed with oilseeds production, in which palm oil is part, and then forestry, in which wood products are part. And wood products are, as we know, the primary ingredients for the packaging materials for the industry as well. And at a much lower rate, we also have cereals, agricultural crops, basically cereals, vegetables, rice, etc. We touched upon a little bit about the waste, but we haven't really talked about the main large topic of the industry, which is pollution waste, which is associated with the plastic waste pollution. And in fact, 50% of the global total of plastic waste comes from the packaging, which we know is highly used and relied upon in the industry. And in 2015, 407 million of tons of primary plastics were produced. Around 3/4 of it ended up as waste. And this is equivalent to 300 202 million of tons ended up as waste. So it's a large scale number. Now that we touched on the natural resources, the reliances of raw commodities and the impacts it has on the environment, let's really look at the actual supply chains itself. Forced and child labor controversies are common and very prevalent in the industry. And this is partly because the industry is composed of a large share of migrant workforce that we know are commonly known to be vulnerable to labor rights abuse. Migrant workforce provides a critical labor skills and efforts to the industry because we conduct intensive agriculture sector, but on top of that also more and more migrant workforce actually does the job that nobody wants to do for a better paid job. And the data shows here from the ILO, agriculture, including seafood, recorded 11% where forced labor cases cured. And I also included manufacturing, which is slightly higher, and this includes as well food manufacturing at 15%. Wholesale and trade definitely involves retailers aspects to it, as well as the food service businesses in which it is part of the food system. And the child labor itself as well has been very common in the industry. Among this number that you've seen on the screen, 60% of child labor work in the agricultural sector. And hazardous work is referred to children that are exposed to dangerous chemicals such as fertilizers, dangerous equipment, or even illegally employed at night. Now that we have spoken about the externalities, the impacts, we see that it has been a wake-up call for consumers, first of all. Now that technology advances, we become more connected to the world and to what's happening outside our jurisdiction. And more, the industry is awaking, same for investors as well as the regulators. As you can see here, the mushrooming of regulations globally. I will not take you through every regulations that you see on the slide, but I'd like you to take note on two. The first one being the European Environmental Human Rights Due Diligence, which has been proposed and approved to proceed to set an EU-wide mandatory human rights due diligence to address and to set up a level playing field for all the mushrooming of national regulations at the EU level. But basically, in essence, this regulation aims to require companies to put in place due diligence procedures for their supply chains beyond their own operations, so beyond the operations they own. So this also includes non-EU operating companies with whom the EU-based companies have business relationship with. And this is not just about procedures, but this also involves the proof of evidence and that compliance is met, etc. So this is a milestone in our opinion. And in addition to that, if we look into another continent, which is the United States, and it has been happening on the US Customs and Border Protections, or USCBP, for their withhold release orders. In brief, it basically is an import ban for products that have been produced or suspected to have been produced by forced labor. So it's very specific on forced labor. So anyone can literally raise to CBP, report to CBP about the suspicion of these products being produced by forced labor, that CBP then will look into and decide on whether or not a withhold release order will be imposed. Based on my analysis to date, there are 19 active withhold release orders put for the food-related producers and factories around the world. And this is a very high risk for the companies in the industries, because not only their supply chain will be disrupted, but also it involves a reputational damage and brands for their business activities. And a similar regulation is also coming in the European Union landscape, but more on the deforestation-free products. It is still at a very preparatory stage. So, but the intention is similar with the US CBP. This is all to say that this industry has been a wake-up call for everyone, and it basically exactly the ESG risk itself that trigger the tiger. But would not like us to forget that the food and beverage sector plays a very significant role in sustaining humans' livelihoods and socioeconomic development, particularly in developing countries. We know as the production and manufacturing activities normally take place in developing countries, it helps to sustain the human's livelihood, but also to influence our global diet. And now more and more the companies are willing to be part of the solutions. They're coming up with various emerging practices, and there are actually a set of various emerging practices, but here for our discussion today, I'd like us to only note down on 3. So the first being the diversification efforts. So now more and more companies are switching to find ways on alternative or hybrid proteins, as well as sustainable or organic options. So basically organic products that use less or no pesticides whatsoever, as well as alternative based proteins that address our high consumption of beef production. And if you remember in the other slide, that beef production contributes highly negatively to the greenhouse gas emission and deforestation. Second, technology and supply chain traceability. As we know that because of this complex web of supply chains, there has been a movement to leverage the supply chain traceability through the use of technologies such as blockchain to track the product's journey from farm to fork, as well as the inventory management of itself. And in addition to that, there has been also an innovative approach using satellite imagery, GPS, artificial intelligence to track deforestation rates and also their entire value chains actors. Last but not least is on the waste issue. As we know, plastic waste has been a huge topic and a problem. More and more companies are coming up with sustainable, innovative packaging. So some of the emerging practices noted down here, more and more they put efforts in incorporating materials made up of 100% recycled material. They collaborate with companies, for example, a biotechnology company, to develop a biodegradable film synthesized by microorganisms, as well as coming into a multi-year supply chain agreement within the sustainable packaging industry. And most importantly, also actively getting involved in the issue or in the projects of collection points, sortation ways, and processing and recycling facility, which we know that the world is still not advancing much on this issue with regards to availability, accessibility, and usability of the collection points, sortation, and processing. I think I'm going to stop there, and I hope that within this short presentation, I trigger some of the points that could be useful for our discussion today.
Thanks a lot, Sairindri. It was really enlightening to have this overview of all the sustainability-related challenges faced by the industry. Obviously, we will not have the opportunity to discuss all of them today. We will be focusing mostly on the environmental dimension, but it's good that you spend some time shedding also the social-related challenges faced by this industry, which, as you showed us, are enormous as well. To get the conversation started, it would be good to go back to the basics, and the basics here meaning the consumer, you and I. Everyone needs to eat after all, and we are all faced with a dilemma. Many people would like to, after having, for example, watched this webinar, make better food consumption decisions. But how can we? So my first question, and I would ask you, David, if you don't mind, to get us started here, is how do you give consumer what they want and help them to make better decisions when it comes to food?
Yeah, thanks, David. That's a very important question. And especially when you start to think about how much our diet contributes to our overall, for example, carbon footprint, anything up to around about 30% of your individual carbon footprints related to the food you're eating, right? So understandably, food systems, sustainable food systems are getting a lot of attention, and rightly so. Been a lot of surveys out there looking at consumer sentiment and the want to make a change, to make improvements, to have a better choice, do something not only perhaps for their health, but also for the planet. So how do you do this? And what you're starting to see now is the rise of food labeling schemes, particularly eco-labeling schemes, but also carbon labeling. It's been surveyed that there's a willingness for consumers to pay more for sustainably marketed foods. You see that actually particularly playing out in the US CPG markets themselves. And this is driving change in the industry. But the important thing is that you've got to make it simple. It's a very complex topic, and you need to decomplexify this. If you look at some of the work done recently by Carbon Trust, for example, they did surveys showing that 2/3 of consumers want to see a carbon label on their food. And you see the likes of big CPG companies moving in that direction. But it's a little bit difficult for a consumer to judge, is that a carbon footprint, is it good, bad, or indifferent? How do I judge? And so you start to now see the rise of what we call eco-labeling schemes, which are like a traffic light-based system, and this is based on full environmental footprint. So it's not just about carbon. Of course, we all know that's very important, decarbonization of our food system, but it's about taking in all aspects of environmental footprint, which was mentioned in the opening address. And that's based on scientific principles, LCA analysis in about 16 different dimensions, and converting those outcomes into an understandable scoring system and a traffic light based system. So A is a green and is seen to be good, versus say down to an E, which is red, and it has is not so good. And it follows the principles of things like Nutri-Score, which you're seeing actually quite extensively being used across Europe, again, to decomplexify what is complex nutritional information on pack. So the idea is that you're starting to see this being tested. It's being played out with multiple retailers across Europe, for example, and big CPG companies involved as well, right as we speak, with the aim to start implementing some of this in 22, 23. And that starts to give us, all of us, some insights into what to choose and make a conscious choice with the food that we're picking up. It's really important is measurement, and using accurate measurement. And I can't stress that enough, David. Using full LCA analysis, using most up to...
Sorry to interrupt you, David. Life cycle analysis, for those who might not be familiar with that acronym.
Correct. Thanks. Yeah, life cycle analysis. This is really looking at the complete footprint of the product, the food that is produced. And once you're measuring accurately, then of course you can act. You can't improve what you don't measure. So once you measure, you can make those improvements and convert that into understandable information.
Thank you, David. Carlotte, do you also think that a Nutri-Score or a traffic light system is the solution to make our food choices more palatable to us?
I definitely think it's part of the solution, and extremely important. And I think, educating consumers and giving them the option is going to be critical over the coming years. I think maybe one thing I would add is that research shows that there's really 3 key drivers that drive consumer purchasing behaviors, and those are taste, price, and convenience of products. So you got to taste good, they need to be affordable and widely available. And although sustainability and health are really big drivers as well, if those first 3 elements aren't met, then often consumers, although they want to, still won't kind of choose for those options. And I think we can kind of look historically and see that that's true. I mean, scientists, health experts, animal welfare experts, for example, have been telling people for decades to cut down their meat consumption, either for the environment or for health reasons, but with little to no avail, because it's so hard for consumers to give up those familiar foods that are so kind of culturally strong as well. So that's why it's going to be so important to make kind of the better, more sustainable option, the default option, make it widely available, make it price competitive. And so, for us at the Good Food Institute, we really believe that accelerating sustainable proteins like plant-based meat and cultivated meat is part of the solution, because it allows people to keep choosing the familiar foods they love They don't have to give anything up, but produced in a more sustainable and healthier way, as long as, once again, it meets those three criteria of kind of taste, price, and convenience.
Great, thank you, Carlotte. And staying with you, and to elaborate on that, if we take the point of view of Europe, because each continent faces different challenges because of their food intake, calorie intake, and their food mix. But looking at Europe specifically, what do you see as the lowest hanging fruit in terms of what we can do to transform our food system to make it more sustainable?
Yeah, well, maybe kind of building up on what I was just saying, I think one of the most effective and impactful things we can do is really double down on this plant-based eating trend that we're seeing right now. I mean, Sairindri mentioned that animal agriculture contributes about a quarter of global greenhouse gases. But research done around plant-based products and those life cycle assessments have found that moving towards plant-based meat can reduce greenhouse gas emissions of these products by about 90% because it requires less land, less crops, less water. And the great news is this is something that European consumers are really already getting on board with. There was a really large survey done earlier this year, about 10,000 European consumers across the continent, and about 30% of consumers already identify as flexitarians, or people who are actively trying to reduce their meat consumption at times. And this is not even taking into consideration about the 6 to 8% of vegans and vegetarians we have in the world, or in Europe. So we have almost 40% of people kind of trying to actively reduce their meat intake. And this has also been kind of reflected in the retail sales data. If we look at kind of plant-based sales in Europe over the past 2 years, the market has exploded by and is growing up by 50%. So I think the best thing we can do, because people are aware of this trend, they're interested in this trend, is making these products, continue to make them more available, continue to make sure they meet consumer needs in terms of taste, price, and convenience, and reduce some of the barriers around, for example, eating out, that can still be a challenge, or learning how to cook with them, for example. So I think, yeah, that is definitely one of the lowest hanging fruits there is.
Great, thanks, Carlotte. This is a very clear message, and that, of course, it can be a solution. I suspect David will bring to this question a slightly different perspective, which would be very interested to hear. And afterwards, maybe Sairindri, if you want to give us more the analyst point of view on that question. But first to you, David.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, and it's an interesting area. Of course, there's no one silver bullet you can say to make improvements. And of course, we see these dietary shifts happening understandably, and it's all part of that solution. But I think also you got to look at the food system. If you look at animal agriculture, it's a huge industry and it's highly nuanced. Often global average figures are bounded around and everybody's rolled up into one figure. But what we do know, getting down into the detail, is that you have extremely sustainable animal production. And of course you have the opposite. So it's not to say everything is black or white, but there's been tremendous changes happening. There are very progressive producers of animal protein, whether we're talking milk, meat, fish, or eggs. And you're starting to see even now products coming to the market net zero in terms of emissions, where they've made conscious reduction programs in the production of the protein. And you're going to see more and more of this, and understandably so. The industry needs to make those changes. It's not business as usual, but we can't escape the fact that the population is growing worldwide, of course. By 2050, we know the figure, 9.7 billion, whatever. And there is this expected increased demand of about 70% increase of animal-based foods. And there's not a lot of reasons around that, cultural reasons, the need for some people in their diets, but that's the fact. And of course, that means that we have to do better. We got to get more out of less. And that really important point is the adoption of technology. There's a lot of technologies that are available today that do that. They improve productivity of animal protein production. FAO has done a lot of work looking at the implementation of best practice. You take the top 10% performing farming businesses, and if you implement that, you have double-digit reductions in terms of carbon footprint, if you can do that right. And without making structural changes to the farm. So this is really important, making sure it's easy for a farmer to implement these new technologies. We know that we can also reduce the issue of methane production, for example, from the ruminant business, highlighted as a key point of climate change and having to be addressed. There are these technologies coming through. But I think the other point also, which we need to address, is one thing in terms of productivity and production and reducing footprint of the protein produced itself. But we also got to look at the amount of food loss and waste that's happening in the system. And we're all part of that equation, right, as individuals. And there's a tremendous amount of loss there. Everything from, producing, whether it's a crop on the field all the way through animal production through to consumption in the house. And these, I think, changing our habits in that respect can have a big impact, of course, I'd say.
Great. Back to you, Sairindri, the lowest hanging fruits that would maximize our impact in Europe.
Sure, thanks, David. And yeah, it's interesting points that David Nickell actually raised just earlier. I think the way I see it, it's probably first, we also have to make sure that the transparency and the awareness of consumers are guaranteed. So now that consumers are getting more and more aware about their sustainable diets, they're getting more and more demanding as to what extent they understand where their products come from, to what extent they understand what type of ingredients are made up in the products that they consume. So I know that Carlotte mentioned the Nutri-Score earlier as well. So making sure that information is easily transferable and also understandable by the consumers regarding their product health statement or Nutri-Score, etc., will actually be the first meaningful impact. But obviously, this is just an information that you in the end have to disclose. What goes behind that is actually the most important aspect. So I think I agree with David in the sense that now it is really needed for companies and even for the industries in general to come up with more alternative solutions, whether it be regenerative farming practices. And yes, the use of technology is very much important. And on top of that, I'd like to include an additional aspect to it of farmers. So now more and more working together and collaborating and actually incentivizing farmers to adopt regenerative farming practices will be very much important, because right now the issue for the sustainable organic products or even alternative-based products, they're not yet affordable to customers. They're still considered very expensive and therefore only accessible only to certain segments of populations. And this is where the mindset needs to change, and we need some sort of boost or enabling technology or practices or approaches that ensure that not only we encourage farmers to adopt this type of practices, but also making sure that they are accessible and affordable to the customers. And the other aspect is also, which is already an emerging point, which is the improvement of or the increase of research and development on alternative solutions. So now some more and more companies are collaborating with research and development institutes to come up with some sort of alternative based ingredients that use agricultural crops that we know have much lower greenhouse gas emissions, for instance. And yes, David also mentioned the food loss and waste. So this is very much related to how efficient the food is actually produced and managed throughout the value chain. And we often forget when we talk about food and beverage sector, food loss and waste actually contributes 1/3 of our global greenhouse gas emissions. Because we're not only talking about the food we throw away from restaurants, we're also talking about the food that is lost between the farm to the distribution hubs, so the food that is actually lost during the logistical activities of the production. So yeah, finding a good, efficient technology and management strategies to address food waste, as well as really incorporating the work with farmers.
Great, thank you, Sairindri. Can I ask first David and then Carlotte, just to get a bit more down to the details, if you could name, and maybe if I may be even more specific regarding the net zero by 2050 objective of the EU, one product, it could be a more supply chain side product, or it would be a consumer side product, but one product that you see now really tangibly as enabling us to have that impact. I'm sure, David, you have plenty of examples to think of, and you, Carlotte, also with the companies you're in contact with, or you work with. What kind of, what can people who are listening and watching us today can really relate to?
Yeah, so I think when you look at the net zero commitment, clearly big commitment. If you look recently at the IPCC report, it highlighted methane in particular as a greenhouse gas that we need to tackle immediately. It was also raised at COP26, where we had over 100 countries, of course, committing to a 30% reduction in methane emissions by 2030. The EU itself has a methane strategy. It's all rolled up into the whole green move and Green Deal. And if you were to pinpoint one product, I'd say the Bovaer product from DSM, particularly, which is focused on reducing methane emissions in ruminants. And this has been in development for many years. It's now coming into the marketplace and has a lot of science behind it, up to about 50 peer-reviewed papers showing that it consistently reduces methane production from ruminants. We know dairy cows and beef naturally produce methane. It's all part of digesting grass, right? And the microbes they have in their rumen. But we can actually reduce the emissions by a minimum of 30% in dairy cattle, up to 90% in beef. And that's a huge game-changing technology. And let's put that into perspective. If you look at the EU, actually 10% of the EU's greenhouse gas emissions are coming from livestock. Okay, so it's not the global 14.5%. That's an average number. Get down into the EU, it's 10%. And of that 10%, 40% of it is methane coming from ruminants. So here you have a technology which is, it's just got a positive opinion from EFSA that's coming to the market, which will be transformational and enable the EU to really make a step change towards those net zero ambitions.
Great, thank you, David. Very enlightening. If I may just add, so this is a fantastic solution, if I understand correctly, to mitigate one very negative externality from the animal-based nutrition, which is methane emissions. And for our audience, for those who don't know, so ruminants emit methane through their digestive system because they digest fiber in their three stomachs, which then they burp essentially, and that's methane. Now there are other externalities as well, which would not be addressed regarding eutrophisation and so on. And I'm sure we can discuss that afterwards. But before that, if you don't mind, Carlotte, also your someone said before there is no silver bullet, and yet this is with the silver bullet product that could really make a difference for you.
Well, I don't want to repeat myself too much, so I'm not going to espouse the benefits of plant-based and cultivated meat again and again. But I think maybe taking a broader look at this and building up of some of the ideas that David and Sairindri messaged around new technologies and R&D. I do quickly kind of just want to highlight, I think, the role that government can and should be playing in terms of stimulating these new innovative technologies across the sector and investing in open access R&D. I think that's really where the game changer is. I mean, companies across the sector like DSM have already been doing incredible things in kind of finding new technologies that are addressing some of these challenges. But government can play such an accelerating role in this, in that the funds they put in research can be leveraged by companies and stakeholders globally. So much money has gone into renewable energy and into addressing fossil fuels, which is important because that is the #1 driver of climate change. But food is #2. And we've seen a minuscule amount of funding from government in addressing kind of challenges around that. So I think, thinking about EU net zero, governments have a massive role to play to ensure that open access R&D funding goes into finding and accelerating and scaling these new technologies.
Great, thanks, Carlotte. I thought you were going to say the Beyond Burger or the Impossible Burger. Those who don't know, these are plant-based burgers that are extremely realistic in their look and taste. If you had said that, it would have provided me with a nice segue to one of the questions that has come from the audience. And the question, which is a recurring one when people talk about out meat, and I'd like to put it to you, Carlotte, but also to you, David, I try to summarize it. Essentially, we replace animal-based diet with alternative plant-based, often soy-based, and we all know soy is a major cause of deforestation. And so people are asking whether it's actually not as bad as animal-based. I think there's a question here about orders of magnitude and the amount of soy to feed cattle versus feeding humans. But I'd like to hear you both about that, starting maybe with you, Carlotte.
Yeah, David, well, I think the order of magnitude question is a really important one. So I think of the soy that is grown, probably maybe 10% is used for direct human consumption, like in things like tofu, like in things like plant-based meat. So, if we make that switch away from kind of conventional meat to plant-based meat, the amount of soy we're going to need is going to be significantly less and lead to less deforestation in general. And I think maybe pulling out some numbers that I like to use here. If we think about the amount of calories a chicken, which is maybe the most efficient animal out there, requires in terms of nutrients to get 1 calorie of chicken out, it's 9 calories of kind of soy or crops going in for 1 out. If we're talking about pigs, it's maybe a 14-to-1 conversion ratio. For beef, it's I think closer to 30-to-1. So if we're focusing on plant-based, then you have 1-to-1, you're already going to be cutting down indeed the amount of soy needed.
Great. And to you, David, you mentioned Bovaer, which is the big solution today that DSM is bringing to the market to reduce methane emissions from cattle. But DSM is really hedging its bets and has also some great solutions in the plant-based space. So, and you're a scientist, obviously. So what can you bring us information on that question?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the question is very important. Soy is a huge crop which is used in the animal business. 75% goes into animal nutrition. It's a very good crop in terms of nutritional profile, but it does, of course, have a footprint, and that's really important to understand. So, to the question from the caller, you need to understand the actual footprint of the different crops that are coming from the different parts of the world, and that's again getting into the detail. So we're talking about soy, say, grown down in Latin America. You can get soy from other different parts of the world, which will have a completely different footprint because of land differences and land use change and what have you. So you really have to get into the detail. And again, you can't just call out soy simply as soy. There are many differences in there, but it's an important point. And if you look at the animal industry, just on this point, there's this drive away to reduce reliance on soy, and we know we can do that through the use of feed enzyme technology, helping to utilize alternative raw materials, more local raw materials, improving the digestibility of those, and therefore releasing or reducing your requirement on some of these big crops like soy and corn. Okay, so that's a big trend, a big drive for the industry, and that helps in terms of also the amount of feed you need to convert into food, into meat. So if you look at a chicken, typically it's about a 1.5 kilos of feed is required to produce a kilo of chicken. And of course, when you come to a pig, what have you, it's different, it's higher. So these are pretty efficient systems, and as an industry, they're looking for alternatives. So just on that point, but to move on to what we're doing as a company, we also, of course, we play across the complete field from animal production, animal nutrition through to human nutrition. And yes, we are invested in alternative proteins in numerous ways, everything from using canola streams through the canola business of producing, unlocking the protein in some of the waste streams of the canola processing industry to produce what we call canola pro. That goes into the plant-based industry. Again, it's more on circular thinking, low footprint, greater use of raw materials. We're also working in alternative proteins, alternative meats, cultured meat, and what have you, to see how that develops. Of course, it's early days, but these are the technologies. As a science-based company, we're very much involved in these things, whilst at the same time, we make investments and look at single cell proteins, which has an enormous opportunity to scale, and that's a really important thing here. How scalable are some of these technologies? And we see single cell protein as a big potential. But again, all these things are developing. It is, and I agree with Carlotte, technology is a real big driver for change. Getting the right investment, open access to some of these technologies will make a big difference going forwards.
Thank you, David. Sairindri, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think there's one aspect that I actually forgot to mention with regards to the role of the government. So I fully agree with what Carlotte said, that it has a massive role in ensuring not only an open access to technology, but also to sort of set a level playing field for many companies when it comes to what type of information to disclose to the customers, what type of information to disclose about their supply chain, but also at the same time, because we noted that there has been reporting fatigue across the industries, where companies are required to report on their business activities and by various governments, by various mechanisms. And this also triggers some sort of innovations to report, to use digitalized platform to ensure that they can track their supply chains and that the information is available. And this could also be then leveraged as well for cases such as plant-based ingredients, really tracking for the customers to be able to track that from the farm to the fork. And I think this would be a really positive milestone as well for us as the investors and professionally as the analysts, because normally data is always hard to find, also given that the complex web of supply chains of the food industry is just massive. And I could not agree more on the aspect of technology, not only ensuring that the food is efficiently managed, but also ensuring that disclosure of how the food is managed is there.
Great, thanks, Sairindri. If we move on now, remembering that many of our audience, they are investors. So as investors, what are we to make of all this? And specifically when looking at the companies that today are the heart of the food system, companies that you, Carlotte and David, work with, and you, Sairindri, spend your days analyzing. So the question is, do you see them moving fast enough? Are they doing enough? Or do you see them being exposed to a rising risk, be it regulatory or consumer behavior change-led risk? Maybe starting with you, Carlotte, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so we're definitely seeing progress, and I think we're going in the right direction. Some companies are definitely moving faster than others, but across the board, we have to move faster because the scale of the problem we're facing is so large. And I do think investors can play a big role here in ensuring we keep up kind of the pace of change. And maybe just to mention one organization that I think does this really well. There's an initiative called the FAIR Initiative, established by the Jeremy Collar Foundation. And they are creating a global network of investors who are kind of focused on the ESG related risks of the food supply chain, and specifically related to animal agriculture, and conduct research on this and kind of create investor engagement groups to engage in discussion with companies around the risks that they're seeing from a just environmental perspective, but also from a long-term kind of financial perspective. So I think this is a really admirable and definitely an example of the type of engagement that I think investors can and should be doing as we go forward to ensure that, the pace of change continues and hopefully only accelerates.
Good, thank you, Carlotte. How about you, David? You also work closely with your clients. Is there a certain rise in consciousness and awareness, or are they putting themselves at risk?
Yeah, no, certainly. I think in today's environment, you can't not get or be aware of the change and get involved and make change happen. So the clients we work with across all the markets worldwide and the different species, particularly the larger companies, are making substantial changes. You may not see all of this because it's happening behind the public face, but there's a lot which you have to put in place to make change scalable and tangible and measurable. And these companies take this responsibility very seriously. And through our contacts and the work we're doing, we're certainly seeing this take place. Indeed, the things like the FAIR rankings and ratings and kind of calling out companies also brings it to a point where, that makes people act, of course. But I think it's not just that. Companies themselves, there's a lot of brand equity in a lot of these companies, and they have to look after that. We know the banking sector, the investor sector are looking at risk, etc. And the consumers also want change. And so, all of these things are driving the industry to a better place. And so, yes, the change is happening. Can it happen faster? I think it has to happen faster. I think we'd all agree things have to change faster. But I think what's really important is let's not change for the sake of change if we don't know what we're changing for. And again, it comes back to my earlier points. Measurement is really important. You don't improve what you don't measure. And these require substantial investments, some of these companies, a lot of money. So you're not going to spend your money unwisely. So you want to understand exactly what's good, what's not so good, and where to spend, where to invest. And so improvement in measurement, again, I talk about, full environmental understanding and footprint analysis is key to this. We see this and hear this throughout the value chain. All the associated stakeholders want to get down to the detail and understand that. And that in itself will really drive and accelerate change. Once you know, then the technologies are there, you can make substantial steps forward.
Thank you, David. We have 5 minutes left, and we've had several questions asked by members of the audience. We won't be able to discuss all of them, but there is one particular or two that I think I can bundle into one. And it's really related to what everyone has been saying today, is the role of technology. Obviously, all this comes at a cost, as a price. And one question here was about what about small companies producing food and beverage, especially organic one? And are they going to be left behind because of all the new technology that, of course, requires investment? And linked to that, another question we got from someone who says he produces food and beverage from North Africa, but then it is exported and is struggling to remain competitive. So it's a bit of a freewheeling question here, but how do you see the ability of smaller producers from emerging market countries keeping up with the rapid pace of technological change that you're describing, everyone in this discussion? Maybe David, you want to get us started? or share your thoughts out of the box?
Yeah, I mean, there's different levels of technology, of course. And I think what's really important for certain markets is, you want to be tapping into technology, which actually in itself makes your business more productive, right? And without a huge kind of, without any sort of capital expense as such, you don't have to change your system per se, but you start to implement the lower hanging fruit, if you want to call it. The technologies are well proven. What we find sometimes is that that's simply not known, I think, to many companies. You assume, well, this is pretty obvious, some of these technologies, but they're not so well implemented in some parts of the world. I think awareness programs, understanding what is available, what is at hand, what is easy to implement, I think is really important. And of course, yes, you do have other technologies coming into play. But ultimately, where we come from, the technologies we're developing and companies like us, they have to lead to a good return on investment for the user, right? So that in itself should lead to a better bottom line for those clients. At the same time, improving the sustainability of the food and beverage itself. And that's really important, because you're going to have to make those improvements to match up with what the consumers are wanting, etc., and this whole shift in diet and food choice.
Thanks, David. Carlotte or Sairindri, who wants to share some thoughts about that?
Not much to add from my side. I think maybe the only thing is you can also link this back to the discussion we were having earlier around kind of the role of government in open access research, and I think in enabling these technologies to be available not just for the few companies that maybe invest in them, but to a broader audience.
Sairindri?
Yeah, just briefly, I think we raised very important points, and I'd just like to add one thing, also the collaboration between big companies that we know in the picture with the smaller companies. And one challenge that we normally face, at least for the smaller level companies, is that different expectations lie, especially when it comes to requirements for certifications, requirements to get this XYZ labeling. And sometimes it reduces cost for the smaller scale companies. And so it's very important that the industry is aligned on the type of expectation that like to have at the supply chain, but also in the type of the right level of certification, the robustness of certification itself is aligned. Because without that, then there will always be a duplication of cost, even for the industry, for the big companies itself, but also at the expense of the smaller companies.
Thanks, Sairindri. I'm afraid we have reached the end of our time here, unfortunately, because there were other questions, very interesting questions that came in. I would like to thank our three panelists today for sharing their thoughts openly in this highly complex and multi-dimensional topic. I remind you that a replay of this discussion will be available on YouTube. I wish you all to be well, happy end of the year celebration, and until next time. Thank you very much.